Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, 60 glorious minutes of multifaceted discussion where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things, and we feature the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyekulu. Coming up in the next hour, there's been more strident criticism of Nigeria's 2019 general elections, with two US international institutes that monitored the ballot, the NDI and the IRI, saying it did not meet previous standards set in 2015, nor did it meet the expectations of Nigerians. The EU's election observer mission has already concluded that the ballot wasn't transparent and was marred by violence and intimidation. We'll speak to two of the authors of the US election report. And later, we'll have reaction from the two main parties, the APC and the PDP, which were roundly criticized by both the US and the EU election monitoring reports for supporting and presiding over multiple irregularities such as vote buying, fraud, and election-related violence. All that in a moment. Now, it's taken a wee while, but the joint report of two respected US international institutes that monitored the 2019 elections in Nigeria is out, and there's no mincing of words in their strident criticism of the conduct of the ballot. The National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute noted numerous systematic failings, including a lack of transparency, increased politically related violence, vote buying and intimidation of both election officials and voters, and scattered incidents of ballot snatching. They concluded that the election did not meet the expectations of Nigerians and fell far short of the standards set in the previous ballot in 2015. They talked about the poor security situation in Nigeria, which removed important safeguards for election day procedures and raised concerns about the safety of voters and candidates. They suggested that a heavy military presence undermined the integrity of the vote in some parts of the country. Nigeria's Electoral Commission, INEC, as well as the political parties, also received their fair share of criticism. Well, in a moment, we'll speak to the representatives of the two US institutes behind that criticism. But first, here's a short clip from the press conference in Abuja when they unveiled their final election report.
The IRI-NDI mission urges Nigerian stakeholders across the board to seriously consider these and other recommendations to improve the electoral process, unlike in previous years when suggestions by reputable citizen and international observation missions went unheeded. On the legal framework and electoral dispute resolution, pursue a comprehensive, inclusive, and expeditious electoral reform process. Establish time limits for the adjudication of pre-election petitions. On election administration, complete the constituency delineation exercise and identify necessary polling units at least 1 year before the next elections. Make the continuous voter registration process more accessible to voters. Develop and adopt a strong strategic communications plan. Reconsider the order and timing of general elections. Create a process that facilitates suffrage for those on official duty on election day. Adopt more transparent procedures for the tabulation, transmission, and announcement of election results. On political party conduct, urgently commit to and complement measures to strengthen mechanisms for political party internal democracy. Develop and campaign on issue-based platforms that reflect citizen priorities and build the capacity of political parties to monitor elections. Civic engagement. Improve coordination among stakeholders to increase and deepen voter and civic education. Continue efforts to enhance the participation of marginalized groups, including women, youth, people with disabilities, and internally displaced persons, IDPs.
That's Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh there, who's the Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute in West and Central Africa. Well, let's get some more detail now on that report from the people who put it together. Joining me in the studio is the man you saw in that film a short while ago, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. As I said, he's the Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute in West and Central Africa, and Sentell, who is the Country Director for the International Republican Institute here in Nigeria. Thank you very much indeed for coming in.
Thanks.
And I'm going to start with you, since we saw you just a short while ago on that video there. Briefly summarize for us the main points of your findings, because much of what we heard in that clip was recommendations, but we didn't hear much of the findings.
Precisely. I will start by saying that, friends of Nigeria, whom we consider ourselves to be, I think have owe it to the Nigerian people who showed so much hospitality in welcoming us during the electoral process when we came to observe various phases of the elections, that we owe it to them to be able to share with them our findings and make some recommendations, which hopefully, if implemented, could help improve future elections in Nigeria. Our two organizations, the IRI and the NDI, have the benefit of having been in Nigeria since the transition to civilian rule in 1998, 1999. And we have observed every election in this country since that period, every national election. And we've seen the trajectory of Nigerian elections. We noted that the elections in 2011, for example, were much better than the elections in 2007. And the elections in 2015 were even better than the elections in 2011. And we had, like many Nigerians, that expectation that by 2019 will be a perfection of what transpired in 2015. But when we woke up on election day, went to the polls and saw what transpired on election day, we felt that these expectations had not been met, not just for us, but for many Nigerians. And that's what we've heard. And that's why we thought we should highlight that this early to make the urgent appeal that electoral reform needs to be embraced very early on in the process.
Right, and let me bring you in, Sentell. Your conclusion is that the 2019 elections did not meet the expectations of many Nigerians, as Dr. Fomunyoh pointed out. But when you say many Nigerians, that sounds ambiguous. I mean, do you mean the majority of Nigerians who voted?
I think there was a huge expectation among Nigerians leading up to the 2019 elections that, as Chris just said, that we would see improvements from 2015. 2015 was seen as a watershed moment in Nigerian elections, and I think what a lot of Nigerians expected was that 2019 would be even better. We would be able to pass electoral amendments that would help make the 2019 elections better than 2015. But unfortunately, there were some things noticed by many of our observers that did not live up to the expectations that we and many Nigerians led into that.
And of course, one of that and what you stand for, your organizations coming from the United States and part of the foreign policy of the US, is a belief that people have a fundamental right of democracy in theory to choose their leaders and to determine their destiny. You observed, as he said, several elections in Nigeria. Did you get the sense that Nigerians have that right in practice from the 2019 ballot?
Well, it's great to see Nigerians going out to vote on election day. I mean, on the presidential election, there were queues all over Abuja where I observed, and many of our observers saw the same thing. But what we want to ensure that as we are observing these elections, we want to ensure that the process allows all Nigerians to vote. And what we've noticed over the course of last elections, that there's still an issue of many Nigerians not being able to vote. Those who work on election day, security forces, those who are out observing elections are unable to vote. So there's still a level that Nigeria has to work on to ensure that all Nigerians have a right to cast a ballot on election day.
And Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, you were out there observing. Was the problem with the politicians or with the political system as a whole?
I think it's a combination of both. There are a number of issues that if implemented with regards to election administration, could facilitate the process for the voters. And then there are a number of issues that reflect the conduct of political actors. For example, if you look at the party nomination process, the fact that it wasn't very transparent in most cases, it became contentious, and that there was pending litigation even up until election day in a number of cases. When you have that happening amongst political or within political parties, it makes it difficult for INEC to be able to determine at what point it can print ballots, knowing that the candidates that feature on the ballots would be the candidates that would actually be on the ballot by election day. So there are things that need to be done to improve or strengthen the process, and there are other things that political leaders, civic leaders need to help Nigerians imbibe in their attitudes.
And these are things you've noticed in the past, and it's a recurring problem, is it?
That's correct. The things that we've noticed in the past, we've talked about, and unfortunately, we also highlighted in our report the fact that a lot of recommendations have been made in the past with regards to elections in Nigeria, not just by international observer delegations, but even by Nigerian institutions, the OS Commission, that was set up to look at electoral reform, the Ken Namani Committee that also worked on electoral reform. So there are a lot of beautiful recommendations out there. We only would wish that they're implemented and fully implemented to enhance Nigeria's electoral process.
Okay, I'm going to have to ask you to stay with us. We're going to take a short break. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including more of our dissection of that joint final report on the 2019 election in Nigeria, released by 2 U.S. institutes that observed that ballot. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Anyegolo. Now, international election monitoring has, of course, become a prominent tool for promoting election integrity and democracy around the world, including Nigeria. But several factors raise questions about the validity and effectiveness of international election monitoring when organizations have to return to the same countries election after election, as with those groups like the US NDI and IRI and the EU's observer mission. What are they actually accomplishing when politicians continue to cheat in the presence of monitors? Is the mission worthwhile when more and more organizations join the practice without any uniform standards for assessing an election, and when different organizations sometimes disagree? How can outsiders know which organizations are reliable? We'll talk about all that in a moment, but first here's another short clip from that press conference in Abuja when the 2 US election monitoring institutes unveiled their final report on the 2019 Nigerian elections.
2015, there was a progressive improvement in the way in which elections were being conducted in Nigeria. Many of us were around when the 2007 elections took place and came under a lot of criticism, justifiably so. We saw some improvements in 2011, and then we saw even more improvements in 2015, when Nigeria had one of the most credible elections in the country's history, as was hailed by many Nigerians and friends of Nigeria across the world. The hope for many Nigerians was that that upward trajectory would be maintained, and that 2019 will be a vast improvement again on what transpired in 2015. As we stated in our report, those expectations were not met, but our hope is that the preparations for the 2023 elections would begin now. And that's why we're hoping to spur or to contribute to these conversations, because we hope that if the conversations begin now, and a lot of the reform issues that have been touched upon in our report as well as in this session are adopted in a timely fashion, that the election administration authorities, the political parties, civil society, the electorate as a whole would be so well prepared and so well versed with the electoral processes that by the time we get to 2023, we would actually see
a huge and very vastly successful election that Nigerians across the board would be overwhelmingly proud of.
Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh there. Well, as you may have heard, there's been more robust criticism of Nigeria's 2019 general elections, with the two U.S. international institutes that you saw there that monitored the ballot, the NDI and the IRI, saying it neither met previous standards set in 2015 nor the expectations of Nigerians. With me in the studio are two men who helped oversee the preparation of that joint report. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute in Western Central Africa, and Sentell, Country Director for the International Republican Institute here in Nigeria. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Let me ask you, Sentell, was there any attempt to influence your mission of observing the elections here?
No, I mean, the great thing about our two organizations here in Nigeria is that we, in addition to being in Nigeria since 1999, our two organizations have offices here and we have people here. So this is something that we've been doing for some time, and if you're part of an election observation mission, there are many protocols, and there's even a Geneva Treaty that we operate under on how we follow through. So the process is very transparent, it's very open, and it's very clear on how we operate and how we do our observations.
Right, and were there any limits to the access you had based on the terms you negotiated with the government beforehand?
Yeah, so we had our approval from INEC to observe the elections, and we were able to travel about the country and observe the election in those states. So in terms of the work with INEC, there was no issues, and even INEC supports observation because it gives them an opportunity to look back at the election and then use the recommendations that are brought forward in those observations for planning for moving forward. So.
Right. Okay, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, you talked about, in the video we saw at the outset, you talked about the recommendations that you had made. What are you hoping that your report can achieve?
We're hoping that our report can spur a national conversation about electoral reform in Nigeria. In previous years, when we finished this reports of this nature, we basically put them out without having any meetings or any discussions about them. But this year, we felt that it was extremely important that we come back into the country and engage the stakeholders in discussing the content of our report. You may be aware that we had a formal meeting with INEC at which we presented an advanced copy of our report, and we were delighted to hear the chairman of INEC commit to reading through the report and to, even without waiting for legislative action, implement those actions that are within the parameters of INEC's responsibility. We've also been engaging Nigerian civil society and political parties, and we're hoping that this exercise would remind everyone, all of these major stakeholders, of the need to engage in electoral reform as a cross-cutting, a cross-sectorial responsibility. It's not just for INEC alone. In every sector of Nigerian society has a role to play. And I think if there's that comprehensive embrace of electoral reform, these kinds of conversations and our report and the report of other delegations can help contribute to that conversation.
And beyond the hope that you've got, I'm just trying to see it based on the previous recommendations that you've made in previous elections. I mean, what can this realistically achieve?
Yes, I think in politics, timing is everything. And there may be a number of elements that are aligned to obtain from Nigerians greater commitment to reform this time around than was the case in previous years. You may be aware of the fact that there was a huge debate about a bill to reform the Electoral Act, and that the bill ended up being adopted by Parliament, by the National Assembly, but wasn't assented to by the President, and so did not become law. If that bill had become law, it would have allowed INEC to innovate some of its practices to facilitate the
Why do you think it didn't become law?
It didn't become law because, as the President's office explained, it was too close to the elections, and some people may have thought that the passing legislation a few months before Election Day could influence the outcome of the elections. But now that the elections are behind us, And now that we are dealing with an administration that has a second term that is constitutionally the last term in office, we may find more political will.
Right. So there's political room for some action to be taken.
Exactly.
Well,
and if the government wanted to have a legacy project,
right,
that could become one of its legacy projects.
Well, let me ask you this, Sentell Barnes. This is the million-dollar question. Based on your, it's like, oh my God, what's he going to ask me? Based on your observations and your findings, would you say that President Buhari's victory at the polls was a credible one?
Well, that is a million-dollar question. But I would probably say, as part of our observation, we were here to look at the process.
Well, I asked you a direct question.
I know, and I'm gonna get to that question.
You're going to answer it in a circular way.
Not circular, more kind of zigzag. I think that for us, it was looking at the process, and we wanted to make sure that the process, was free and fair for people to participate in. And we saw that there was challenges within the process, and our recommendations are part of that, as Chris was saying, as part of that dialogue to change the process as we move forward in the future.
And if I may just add
please,
that as observers invited into the country by Nigerian institutions, notably INEC, it's important to clarify for the Nigerian people that our role as observers is not to certify or decertify an electoral outcome. Our focus is on the process, making sure that we report accurately and impartially to the Nigerian people.
I understand that, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but when you say that many serious irregularities occurred, including vote buying, intimidation of voters and election officials, and election-related violence, surely all that is enough to undermine the credibility of the election.
Well, we have to also keep in mind that there's still litigation that's pending with regards to the outcome of the elections, and we do not want to become part of that story. And so it's prudent to stay focused on what we found and what we've shared with the Nigerian people in a very open fashion. Ultimately, it's going to be the Nigerian people and Nigerian institutions that will determine the legitimacy of the outcome of the elections.
Right. And you also said, Sentell Barnes, in your report that the political parties remain the weakest link around Nigeria's democratic institutions. Many people would agree with that assessment. Tell us more about your findings there.
Well, I think what we've seen from the elections, as Chris has highlighted some of those things, I mean, when we were meeting with INEC, they mentioned that there are 809 cases that are just from pre-election issues. Those evolve around the primaries. So it's a huge issue that Nigeria is having in its elections, that parties are struggling to even produce the candidates that are necessary to be on the ballot. The other issue, too, is that as Nigerian elections become more competitive, political parties are looking for other ways to kind of, campaign in the process. And so we've seen an insurgence of vote buying. Vote buying has always been there, but we've seen now since INEC has introduced card readers and other innovative ways of protecting the ballot, we've now seen parties adapt other ways of encouraging voters to go out and vote. And so it is a challenge, and these are part of the recommendations that we make to INEC on how to improve the process. But I do think INEC has a hard challenge in dealing with parties. And then also just the idea that, we're dealing with 93 political parties. We had 73 candidates for presidency. It's becoming, it's making the process even difficult for INEC, because INEC doesn't have the amount of time it needs to process all the necessary paperwork for this many candidates on the ballot, or many parties who are registered.
Right. Okay, well, I want to thank both of you very much indeed, and also to thank you for the work that you've been doing consistently over the years in Nigeria in trying to get people on the straight and narrow as far as the elections are concerned. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute in West and Central Africa, and Sentell Barnes, Country Director for the International Republic Institute here in Nigeria. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including we'll have reaction from the two main parties, the APC and the PDP, which were roundly criticized by both the US and the EU election monitoring reports for supporting and presiding over multiple irregularities in the election. Stay with us.